My name is Owen Symes, and welcome to The Copagandists, a podcast about cop shows and the people who make them. This week we'll be discussing the birth of television in the United States, what companies came to dominate it, how those entities organized among themselves, and how production methods first used in radio and film adapted to the new medium. The technology for television had been in development before the start of World War II, but global bloodletting delayed its enthusiastic adoption. Obviously, countries being bombed and invaded were in no position to pioneer tiny screens with moving pictures on them, but this held true for the United States as well, owing to FDR's declaration of a state of emergency in the wake of Pearl Harbor that forced potential TV manufacturers to turn their machinery towards the war effort. With the end of hostilities came renewed opportunity for development, and this centered on the United States, which stood in 1945 as the undisputed economic titan of a still smoldering world. The domestic radio giants we discussed last week, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had only intermittently dabbled with television prior to and during the war, but after 1945 they launched themselves into the burgeoning market, eager to exploit its potential to draw mass audiences. Despite being the newest of the radio giants, CBS took an early lead in the development of a TV broadcasting network. Because U.S. television grew out of radio, it inherited a number of structural traits from that industry, most importantly the network affiliate system. In this system, the three major networks not only controlled their own broadcast stations in the largest markets, but also acted as centers of gravity for locally owned stations. Their size, their ability to create content of a higher production value and broader notoriety, attracted smaller companies to affiliate themselves with a particular network, which then gave them access to exclusive content. In radio, the affiliate system had still left room for independent stations because radio production was cheaper, so local stations could get in on the action. So national networks, while dominant in radio, were not the only game in town. Television, however, was a little different. The production of shows that had both images and sound would prove too expensive for many of the smaller stations to make on their own. Coupled with this production cost was the political muscle of the larger radio networks. As had happened with the Federal Radio Commission in the 1920s, the radio giants now put their weight upon the Federal Communications Commission, successfully lobbying this regulatory body to freeze the issuance of new TV broadcast licenses in the late 1940s. This freeze prevented any new players from entering the competition at this early stage, when the radio giants were at their most vulnerable. They hadn't built up their TV networks yet. This breathing room gave the majors time to solidify their position. So the national broadcasters, who had cash to pay for expensive shows and expensive government influence, came to dominate what aired on the nascent medium. Very quickly then, the radio networks transitioned to television and established a similar structure for broadcasting. The result was a mass medium of truly national dimensions. As TV historian Thomas Schatz put it, during TV's earliest years, fewer than 2% of local stations remained independent from the national networks, and because virtually all local TV stations were network affiliates, American television emerged literally overnight as a genuine mass medium with far fewer stations than radio competing for portions of a truly national audience, and thus providing sponsors with an unprecedented access to the U.S. consumer. Crucially, federal regulations embodied in the FCC directly affected local stations, but not so much the national networks. Remember that the FCC had the power to grant or revoke a specific station's broadcasting license, but really had no way to censor the kind of content that the national networks provided to these affiliates. So while locals were usually happy to receive shows of national prominence, with production values far higher than they themselves could muster, they also had no direct control over this content, which would put them in an awkward position should audiences or politicians become irate. You're a local viewer in the South and you watch something that you think is derogatory towards the South. You call in to complain to the local station. You call to complain to the FCC. What's the local station to do? They didn't make the content, and they have no control over what the network sends them. Puts them in kind of an odd situation. Now, at this time, independent TV stations did not acquiesce without a fight. Early on, a number of them attempted to get out from under the thumb of the radio giants by creating the Television Broadcasters Association, the TBA. For a brief period, this trade association competed with the radio-dominated National Association of Broadcasters that we saw last week, the NAB. But the pre-existing might and prestige of the NAB ultimately prevailed. The TBA collapsed, and going forward, it would be the NAB that would represent the industrial priorities of both radio and television broadcasters. Now comfortably at the pinnacle of the broadcasting industry, the members of the triumvirate, again CBS, NBC, and ABC, like their Roman antecedents, couldn't help but compete with one another for the largest share of national eyeballs. As the oldest TV network, CBS had the head start. This meant that it had the most affiliates across the country, that its reach extended even into the hinterlands and frontiers of the viewing public. And because their audience included a higher proportion of rural and suburban viewers, CBS executives perceived a need to broadcast programs that were more culturally and politically conservative. ABC, on the other hand, was the newest network. It had the fewest affiliate stations, and these were concentrated in U.S. urban centers. So executives there considered younger city dwellers as their typical viewer and preferred to broadcast more youth-oriented shows, whatever that means in the mind of a 60-year-old man. NBC was kind of stuck in the middle and veered sometimes in one direction and sometimes in another, sometimes conservative, sometimes trendier. In the early 1950s, under the helm of Pat Weaver, it provided the most experimental programming, and this pioneering spirit gave it a more prestigious reputation. So with this industry in place, how did they actually make the shows? Well, early TV production had at its core a contradiction. On the one hand, producers and broadcasters sought to import genres and shows from radio that were tried and true, politically uncontroversial, guaranteed to turn a profit. On the other hand, they also wanted to differentiate themselves from film, that other audiovisual medium, and that required some experimentation, an inherently risky proposition. Given its corporate origins in radio, it's not surprising that much early television molded itself on the programming formats that were most comfortable for the teams of radio producers moving into TV. These genres were familiar territory, both creatively and economically. And this helped the TV industry normalize its existence, get things out the production pipeline. The most popular radio formats, like the mystery suspense anthology or the police procedural, all found a home in early television. And this gave audiences something familiar to grasp onto, producers a kind of creative shortcut, and censors less innovation to worry about. In addition to these genre holdovers, however, early TV did experiment with different kinds of programming, much of it filmed live, rather than being pre-recorded. This included everything from Shakespeare plays and modern social dramas to musical performances, talk shows, and game shows. Live performance attracted TV producers for both practical and artistic reasons. The radio networks had based themselves in New York, rather than Hollywood, so when they shifted to TV production, they didn't have easy access to the massive production studios and backlots and filmmaking equipment of Hollywood. This meant they had to experiment with what they already had. At the same time, network executives were looking for ways to differentiate their admittedly lower production value shows from the glossy and expensive film world. Unable to match Hollywood in raw production quality, some in TV thought they could instead entice audiences with live drama, which, they argued, had more immediacy and vitality. They hoped that this combination of being cheaper to make and also different would result in profitability. Live drama did initially provide a cultural cachet, a prestige to television, but economically the format just couldn't last. It lacked the flexibility, the controllability of pre-filmed content, and critically, live content could not be rebroadcast for further profit. While many initially assumed that people just wouldn't be interested in watching the same TV show more than once, that novelty was the most important thing to viewers, some at the time did wonder at the potential for rebroadcasting as an avenue for additional profit. And as it turned out, this would prove quite profitable indeed. And live drama only had a limited place in that world. As live TV came into its own, Hollywood still wasn't sure what to do with the new medium. Certainly, something had to be done. Post-World War II, Hollywood was not in a good spot. Box office returns had begun to plunge dramatically, and some executives blamed this on television, although legends about early Hollywood hostility to television are overblown. Indeed, some executives actually wanted to expand into television, and so were understandably upset to discover that the radio networks had manipulated federal regulators to shut out potential competition. Remember, with that freeze on new broadcast licenses. Moreover, antipathy towards television, whether it was caused by a fear of competition or ire at lobbying shenanigans, didn't extend to all movie makers. The large studios might be arguing internally about whether to ignore or destroy or involve themselves with TV, but a stretch of Sunset Boulevard known as Poverty Row had already begun producing content for the small screen in the late 1940s, working with ABC first of all. This was the first instance of a TV network signing production deals with Hollywood studios, and it gave ABC access to high-volume, low-cost products from existing companies like Monogram Studios. Pretty quickly, others jumped into the fray, some from major studios like Jerry Fairbanks, others from the world of acting like Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, and of course radio men as well, notably Frederick Ziv and yes, Jack Webb. October 1954 proved the turning point for the Hollywood majors. Early in the month, Columbia Pictures began producing The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin for ABC, the first episodic programming to be made by a major Hollywood studio. It also began production on Father Knows Best for CBS. Only days later, major Hollywood independent producer David O. Selznick, who had once made Gone with the Wind, began making TV, with Walt Disney doing likewise. By the end of the 1950s, the large studios were well underway to adapting their production capacity to the making of television, largely, as it turned out, by subcontracting the work to smaller independent producers. Now, TV production became such big business that some majors actually neglected their theatrical productions. In January 1959, at which point Warner Bros. Had become the largest maker of TV shows, actually found itself without a single motion picture ready for theatrical distribution. This system solidified into a consistent and relatively predictable pipeline. Pre-recorded content was created within the Hollywood studio system. This programming was then distributed to network-affiliated stations across the country for initial broadcast. The content was then repackaged and sold again for subsequent broadcast by really anyone willing to pay the fee. This is called syndication. And since TV was so new and the networks and affiliates so voraciously hungry for anything they could broadcast to audiences, Hollywood studios also started allowing their back catalogs of old movies and cartoons to be broadcast on the small screen. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. Hollywood studios gained a market for old properties and new output. The subcontracting of their actual work allowed the major studios to minimize risk while maintaining control over distribution. Independent producers gained access to studio resources and an outlet for their creativity. TV networks gained access to a steady stream of programming. And audiences got more stuff to watch. Now, this had the interesting effect of shifting television's center of gravity. Whereas New York, home of the radio networks, had been the home of early live television, now that Hollywood had got back into the business, Los Angeles once more became the hub of US entertainment. So it was the Hollywood-made telefilm or filmed series that began to pad the stomach of the hungry medium, leaving less and less room for live content. By this point, distributors realized that audiences would actually watch the same program more than once. Local stations hungered for something to broadcast to their audiences, and Hollywood studios were finally coming around to producing shows for television. All of these pressures pushed creatives towards pre-recorded programming. Live shows would continue, but as game shows, talk shows, news, and sports. The theatrical and dramatic programs that had so impressed critics had by the end of the 1950s essentially gone extinct. The most popular early form of telefilm was the anthology. As a flexible method of storytelling, anthologies proved very popular with TV producers and so abounded throughout the 1950s. Because these telefilms were composed of several unrelated and self-contained stories, once an anthology finished its initial run on TV, these individual stories could then be taken apart, bundled with other stories, and aired again. Editors could tailor these bundles for specific marketplaces and so attract local advertisers. As a result, nearly 2,000 standalone telefilm anthologies were circulating by the middle of the decade. Many of these shows actually proved both critically and commercially successful, though some observers lamented the death of live TV as signaling an inevitable degradation of the quality of TV programming. As TV coexisted and then began to give way to the telefilm, so too did the anthology coexist with and eventually succumb to something new: the episodic series. Executives liked episodic shows in general because they provided compact stories that made room for advertisers, while the recurring characters had the potential to keep audiences engaged via what we would now call a parasocial relationship. I Love Lucy led the way. Now, it was in episodic programming that the critics found real cause for concern. While episodic shows didn't need to be mediocre, I Love Lucy stands the test of time, network executives and not a few creatives were perfectly happy with mediocrity because they only had to make the shows just compelling enough to get people to tune in and watch the ads. And now we get into the subject of profitability, how television made its money. So we've covered how it was organized, we've covered how the shows were made, now we're covering how they got paid for. To make its money, much of early TV relied on direct corporate sponsorship, wherein one company would sponsor one show. Without the need to accommodate advertising time, and within the innovative setting of live drama, creatives were given at least some space within which to experiment. And the most interesting and challenging of this early programming is remembered with justifiable fondness, even reverence. This is the television of Paddy Chayefsky and Rod Serling. Hence early TV's reputation among some scholars and critics as a golden age for the medium. Although, as we'll see next week, the sponsorship model could harm as well as help the creative process. This corporate sponsorship model functioned moderately well for around a decade, but over time it became both less tenable for the sponsors as well as less profitable for the broadcasters. On the sponsor side, TV production costs rose steadily as the medium gained legitimacy, as stories grew more ambitious, and as stars became more lucrative. Businesses found it harder and harder to foot the bill for a sponsorship all on their own. On the broadcasting side, the networks began to see both economic and political reasons to get off sponsorships. As television beamed into more and more homes with each passing year, the number of viewers went up, and so too did the value of airtime. Network executives wanted to capitalize on this by opening up their airwaves to more and more advertisers, who would then bid among themselves in order to gain access to airtime. Networks also began to see sponsors as competitors for control of the medium itself. The largely sponsor-driven machinations behind the quiz show scandal, say that 5 times fast, of the 1950s, where individual sponsors had rigged game shows and caused a national scandal and much embarrassment for the hapless TV networks. This scandal drove home to the networks the desirability of control over the content that they aired. Having a variety of corporations pay for ad time meant that networks did not have to bend to the will of a particular sponsor. Because a multitude of advertisers made for better business and better politics than singular sponsors, advertising supplanted sponsorship by the end of the decade. Sponsorship didn't go away. Advertisers could also exert power over the network from time to time, so the political and economic problems that the networks faced in the 50s didn't just disappear. But it is true that this shift left the major broadcasters in a much stronger position going into the 1960s. So individual sponsors like Ford Motor Company could still exert some pressure here and there. Advertisers could sometimes band together during an especially volatile political episode and threaten to boycott particular shows or time slots or networks. But because the networks were only 3 and the advertisers were many, it was much harder for the advertisers to come together and collectively pressure the networks. While the advertising model gave networks more control, it also imposed upon TV producers a more rigid structure. Increasingly, the kinds of programs that advertisers wanted, and therefore that network executives preferred, had to accommodate for the ads. This produced in many television shows the same segmentation of plot, simplification of story, as was often found in radio, as well as a preference for episodic storylines. Development and exposition, ratcheting up of suspense and tension, story climax, all of these now had to make room for Colgate and Ford, and most importantly to the story of the police procedural, Big Tobacco. With network power better secured against independent producers, ad agencies, and sponsors, the end of the 1950s through the 1970s were the heyday of the network triumvirate. Ad revenues were up, cultural reach was practically universal, and everyone was hungry for content. It was the ascendancy of what network executive Paul Klein once characterized as least objectionable programming. Writing in the 1970s, Klein summarized the idea as follows. We, the networks, exist with a known television audience, and all a show has to be is least objectionable among a segment of the audience. When you put on a show, then, you immediately start with your fair share. You get a 32 share. That's about a third of the network audience. And the other networks get their 32 shares. We all start equally. Then we can add to that by our competitors' failure. They become objectionable, so people turn to us if we're less objectionable. Or we could lose audience by inserting little tricks that cause a loss of audience. Thought, that's tune out. Education, tune out. Melodrama's good, a little tear here and there, a little morality tale, that's good, positive. That's least objectionable. It's my job not to cause any tune-out a priori in terms of ads or concepts, to make sure that there's no tune-out in the shows vis-a-vis the competition, and to look and see where I can take advantage of their vulnerability. In other words, the point wasn't to rock the boat or take big risks in order to drive rivals into the ground. The point was to keep the oligarchy on an even keel, maybe eke out a minor lead over the competitors, but never to risk sinking the whole ship. Now, this executive, Klein, also articulated the qualities that he looked for in a successful show. Spoiler alert, these did not include artistic integrity or psychological profundity. One of the qualities I look for in a program to be commercial, popular success is what I call fake realism, phony realism, the illusion that you're getting something meaningful. You then overlay that with what I call trash. That's the ideal program to get a woman between 18 and 49 to watch, and that is the ideal market. It's not Camus, but it's the ideal content to fit the nature of a time waste, which is what people use media for. People then read into it that it was really a work of art or whatever. It might even be a work of art. Who am I to judge a work of art? Casablanca is now considered a work of art as a movie. There's nothing in there of any consequence, but it's considered a work of art. When people study it, they tear it apart. It was just an exploitation film with 2 stars. We're looking for that kind of thing. And in the future, someone will say that Roots, or something like it, is art. Fake realism like Roots, I think, is one of the ideals. Now look, you can't help but admire this level of honesty. Just the complete lack of pretension is extremely refreshing to me, as someone who's read so much squirmy network executive trying to defend his network before Congress type of bullshit. He's not hiding behind public interest platitudes or any kind of prestige. He's just saying, like, look, this is business. We're just pumping out trash. And if you find anything meaningful in it, that was an accident, but good for you. Note that implicit in Klein's emphasis on avoiding what he called tune-out is advertising. For the whole point of attracting viewers, continued into the 70s to be providing an audience to whom businesses could advertise. Ergo, the success of a show was not measured by its critical appraisal or even necessarily direct audience feedback. Rather, success was measured purely in terms of the number of people watching a given program. Its rating. The dominant player in ratings measurement was, and actually remains, the Nielsen Company, which had begun keeping its ratings index in 1950. In the early days of the industry, when sponsorship reigned supreme, ratings, they really only mattered if they were abysmal. As one longtime CBS and NBC executive put it, occasionally we got a really disastrously low rating on one of our shows, Playhouse 90, like a 7 share, and someone would mention it to us, but it wasn't like a call from someone saying, "My God, it's a disaster." It was just an interesting statistical thing. As the decades wore on, however, ratings would become more and more the metric of choice. So what was the result of all this? Well, whatever the quality of the shows, however the revenues came in, and whoever made them, U.S. television remained fundamentally a privately dominated system. The public, represented by the government, would stay outside the production and distribution system. As the FCC once explained in answer to a little girl's request that her favorite shows be made longer, "Mary, while you may be too young at the present time to understand the full meaning of what I'm going to say, I'll try to explain briefly, broadcasting as it is done in our country. In America, broadcasting is under private enterprise. This means that the man who operates a radio station selects the programs that are to be broadcast. The government requires that he operate the station in the public interest. That is, he must broadcast programs that will serve the different interests of the people living in his city. To prevent any possibility of the FCC taking over powers contrary to those intended, the Congress stated that this commission should have no power of censorship over radio programs. The commission reviews the station's overall operation at certain times to determine that it has been operating in the public interest. However, it cannot tell a station what programs to broadcast. In some other countries, Mary, the people can hear only the programs that the government wants them to hear." Of course, here in Paradise, we hear only the programs that private fiefdoms prefer. Just as God intended. In the US, the primary audience was advertisers and sponsors. They were the ones paying the networks to make things. As one network executive said at the height of TV power, "The primary purpose of American television as it's presently constituted is to deliver an audience to an advertiser at the lowest cost per thousand. Quality, style, content, these are all matters of subjective taste, and they are important only as they relate to the rise and fall of the ratings, which are the yardstick by which television time is sold." And as we'll see next week, the money men had some strong opinions concerning the kinds of shows that they wanted stations to broadcast. Sometimes this related to their perception of audience preferences. Other times, however, it had much more to do with the proclivities of particular advertisers. Whether they were individual sponsors or advertisers as a group, shows would not escape their influence. Well, thanks for listening to this week's episode covering the emergence of the big three TV networks, the establishment of a working relationship between television and Hollywood, and the solidification of the advertising model of revenue. Join me next time for a look at some of what resulted from this new industry, TV's earliest crime dramas and police procedurals, the immediate predecessors to Dragnet. Sources are in the show notes. You can find an essay version of this script, complete with detailed citations, on my Substack at substack.com/@OwenSimes. You can also find me at Blue Sky at Owen-Simes, YouTube at Integral History, and check out my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. See you next time.